Aunt Evelyn is basically broke, my niece Chloe said one Sunday afternoon, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, as if the words were harmless, as if I weren't sitting just 12 feet away at the end of the oak table polishing a set of old silver spoons. The room went quiet for half a second after she said it, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before people decide whether something was rude or just awkward. Then someone chuckled. My brother Daniel cleared his throat and kept cutting his roast. Chloe smiled like she had just made a clever little observation about the weather. I didn't say anything. At 72 years old, you learn that silence is sometimes more useful than defense. The afternoon sunlight came through the kitchen window, warming the table where the rest of the family sat talking about vacation plans, home renovations, and new cars. Conversations about money have a different tone when everyone assumes you don't have any. I finished polishing the spoon, placed it carefully beside the others, and looked down at my hands. They were steady. They had always been steady. Chloe was 27, bright, ambitious, and convinced the world was something that could be arranged neatly if you were clever enough. She worked in marketing downtown and liked to speak about financial strategies and building long-term value. Phrases she probably repeated from podcasts she listened to during her commute. In her mind, my quiet life on the edge of Cedar Ridge was a kind of cautionary tale. A small white house. A 12-year-old sedan in the driveway. A vegetable garden out back instead of a landscaped lawn. She believed she understood what that meant. Most people do. They see simplicity and assume failure. I could feel her eyes drift toward me occasionally as the conversation continued, like she was studying some distant example of what not to become. You know, she said a few minutes later while scrolling through something on her phone, housing prices around here are exploding. That little property Aunt Evelyn has might actually be worth something now. The way she said it made the table grow quiet again. Not uncomfortable quiet. Curious quiet. My brother finally looked up. It's been in the family a long time, he said carefully. Chloe nodded slowly, thoughtful now, calculating. Right? Which means someday it'll probably pass down. That's usually how these things work. I watched her while she spoke, the calm confidence in her voice, the certainty that she understood the future. People often talk that way when they think time is predictable. I folded the last cloth and set it beside the silverware tray. Outside, a breeze moved through the maple tree near the porch, its leaves flickering softly in the late afternoon light. Chloe leaned back in her chair and smiled again, satisfied with her own conclusion. Honestly, she added casually, I just hope Aunt Evelyn has something saved. Living on a fixed income these days must be terrifying. A few sympathetic murmurs circled the table. Someone reached for the mashed potatoes. Someone else started talking about mortgage rates. Life moved forward in that ordinary way conversations do, but the words Chloe had spoken stayed in the room like a faint echo. I stood up slowly and carried the tray of silverware to the cabinet near the sink. The wood door closed with a soft click. From the dining room, I could still hear Chloe explaining something about investment portfolios and future planning. Her voice confident, assured, completely certain about the story she believed was unfolding. What she didn't know was that sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who have already made the most important decisions. And sometimes a single decision, made calmly and without announcement, has the power to change someone's entire future. The evening after that dinner felt quieter than usual, although nothing about Cedar Ridge had actually changed. My house sat at the end of a narrow road where the pavement softened into gravel, the same place where my husband Robert and I had lived for almost 40 years before he passed away. The porch light glowed gently over the wooden steps, and the faint scent of tomato plants drifted through the open kitchen window. I set a kettle on the stove and waited for the soft whistle that always came after a few minutes. People imagine that a small house means a small life. I have heard that assumption more times than I can count. They see the faded blue shutters, the old mailbox leaning slightly toward the road, the sedan that has been with me for more than a decade. They imagine quiet struggle. They imagine worry. What they do not imagine is choice. The kettle began to hum, and I poured hot water into a chipped white mug that had once belonged to my mother. Outside, the porch swing moved gently with the evening breeze. Nights in Cedar Ridge have a way of stretching out peacefully, especially in early autumn when the air begins to cool, but the crickets are still loud in the grass. I carried the tea to the small kitchen table and sat beside the window where the maple tree cast long shadows across the yard. My life has always looked simple from the outside. I stopped buying new cars years ago. I learned that fresh vegetables from a garden taste better than anything from a store. And after Robert died, I stopped feeling the need to explain my decisions to anyone. A quiet life can confuse people who measure success by noise. Earlier that afternoon, I had watched Chloe study my house the way a real estate agent studies a property. Her eyes lingered on the corners of the room, the antique clock on the wall, the worn hardwood floor that Robert refinished himself many summers ago. It was subtle, but I noticed it. At my age, you learn to notice small things. You notice pauses in conversation. You notice when someone asks questions that sound casual, but are really calculations. The clock on the wall ticked slowly while I drank my tea. The same steady rhythm that had filled this house for decades. When Robert was alive, we used to sit here together in the evenings, talking about everything from the weather to the future of the town. Back then, people assumed we were comfortable. After he passed away, the assumptions changed. Widows, in the minds of many people, slowly fade into modest lives and smaller expectations. I never corrected them. There is a certain freedom in letting people misunderstand you. I rinsed the mug in the sink and turned off the kitchen light before stepping onto the porch. The sky above Cedar Ridge was deep blue now, scattered with the first quiet stars of the evening. Somewhere down the road, a pickup truck rolled past, its headlights sweeping briefly across the trees. I sat on the porch swing and listened to the night. Chloe believed she understood my situation. She believed my life was a narrow path defined by limitations. And perhaps from the outside it looked exactly that way. But what she could not see from the dining room table earlier that day was how long a person can spend preparing for a future that others assume does not exist. People like Chloe often believe the world reveals itself quickly. They believe opportunities appear in bright, obvious moments. What they do not realize is that the most important decisions are usually made quietly, in ordinary rooms, long before anyone else understands what is happening. And somewhere between the fading sunlight and the rising evening breeze, I began thinking carefully about the one decision that would soon make all of Chloe's assumptions impossible to ignore. The next morning arrived slowly, the kind of calm morning that makes the whole town feel half asleep. Sunlight crept across the kitchen floor while I stood at the counter slicing an apple and listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Life in Cedar Ridge has always moved at its own pace, and after 72 years I have grown comfortable with that rhythm. I carried my coffee to the small table near the window and watched the road for a moment while the steam curled gently above the mug. Most mornings pass like this. A few cars heading toward town. A dog barking somewhere in the distance. The world going about its business without hurry. What Chloe had said the day before did not bother me in the way she probably imagined. Age teaches you that people reveal more about themselves than they realize when they speak casually about money. The assumption that I was struggling had clearly settled in her mind long ago. That assumption had grown strong enough that she felt comfortable discussing my finances openly in front of everyone. But what interested me more than her words was the look in her eyes when she studied the house. It was the same look I have seen in bankers, real estate agents, and investors over the years. The quiet arithmetic of possibility. Later that afternoon, my phone rang while I was watering the garden behind the house. The number on the screen belonged to Chloe. That alone was unusual. My niece rarely called without a specific reason. When I answered, her voice carried the cheerful tone people use when they're trying to sound spontaneous. She asked how I was feeling and whether I had enjoyed the family dinner the day before. We spoke for a minute about the weather and the tomatoes in the garden. Then the conversation drifted gently toward more practical matters. She mentioned that housing prices in Cedar Ridge had been rising quickly. She said she had been reading about it online. According to her, properties like mine were becoming surprisingly valuable. Her words sounded casual, but there was a careful patience behind them. She asked whether maintaining the house alone was difficult. She wondered if I had ever considered selling the place and moving somewhere smaller. Somewhere easier. Somewhere more practical for someone living on what she called a limited income. I could almost see the picture forming in her mind as she spoke. A quiet widow living modestly, perhaps unaware of the opportunity sitting beneath her feet. It was a story she had already written for herself. I told her the house suited me just fine. I told her the garden kept me busy and the porch swing kept me comfortable in the evenings. She laughed lightly, but I could hear the calculation continuing behind her voice. Before the call ended, she said she might stop by later in the week to visit. She said she had been thinking about family lately and wanted to spend more time together. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and looked out across the yard where the late afternoon light rested gently on the maple tree. Chloe believed she had begun guiding the future with a few well-chosen questions. In her mind, the conversation was the first step in a practical discussion about my life, my property, and eventually what might happen to both. What she did not understand yet was that I had already begun thinking about that future long before she made that phone call. And the decision forming quietly in my mind was not going to lead where she expected. 2 days after Chloe called, the sky over Cedar Ridge turned the pale silver color that usually means rain will arrive before evening. I was in the front yard trimming the edge of the rose bushes Robert planted years ago when I noticed a familiar sedan slow down near the mailbox at the end of my driveway. The engine idled for a moment before the car turned in slowly across the gravel. Chloe stepped out carrying a leather tote bag and wearing the same confident smile she had used at the dinner table. She walked toward the porch with the kind of careful enthusiasm people use when they believe they are about to guide a conversation in a useful direction. I set the garden shears down on the railing and welcomed her inside. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the bread I had baked earlier that morning. Chloe looked around the living room with polite curiosity, but I could see the quiet inspection behind her eyes again. She noticed the old bookshelf Robert built, the framed photographs on the wall, and the antique clock that had been ticking steadily in the corner since before she was born. She sat on the couch while I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and placed them on the coffee table. For a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. Her work in the city, the long commute she made each morning, the rising cost of apartments near her office. Then the conversation began drifting gently in the direction I expected. She said she had been thinking about our phone call earlier that week. She said she hoped I did not mind her asking questions about the house because she only wanted to help. Her voice was warm and patient, the tone of someone explaining a sensible plan. She mentioned that many people my age eventually choose to sell large homes and move into smaller places that require less maintenance. She talked about the financial advantages of making decisions early rather than waiting too long. I listened quietly while she spoke, nodding occasionally while the rain clouds gathered slowly beyond the windows. Chloe leaned forward and rested her hands on the edge of the coffee table. She said she had been researching property values in Cedar Ridge and discovered that homes like mine were becoming surprisingly valuable to buyers moving out of the city. According to her, selling now could provide a comfortable amount of money that would make the future much easier for me. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed she was introducing a practical solution. What she did not realize was that the future she imagined and the future I had already been preparing were very different things. I asked her what she believed would happen to the house after I sold it. She hesitated briefly, before explaining that it would depend on what I decided to do with the money. Perhaps I could move closer to family. Perhaps I could invest the funds and live more comfortably. Her words sounded helpful, but the meaning underneath them was clear. Chloe believed she was helping guide the next chapter of my life. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping gently against the porch roof. The sound filled the room with a slow, steady rhythm. I stood and walked toward the kitchen window for a moment, watching the clouds darken over the maple tree. When I turned back toward the living room, Chloe was studying the photographs on the wall again. She paused longest at the one showing Robert standing proudly beside the house the year we finished building it. That photograph always reminds me how much patience goes into creating something that lasts. Chloe finally looked back at me with an encouraging smile, waiting for my response. In her mind, the conversation was unfolding exactly as she expected. What she could not see yet was that every question she asked was bringing her closer to a future she had never imagined. Chloe left just before the rain began falling harder, her car disappearing slowly down the gravel road while the porch light flickered on above the door. The house felt quiet again, the comfortable kind of quiet that settles in after visitors leave. I stood by the kitchen window for a moment watching the rain slide down the glass in slow, thin lines. Conversations like the one we had just shared often reveal more than people intend. Chloe believed she had taken the first step toward guiding my decisions. She believed the idea of selling the house had been planted gently and would grow naturally over the next few weeks. In her mind, she had been patient and respectful, allowing me to arrive at the conclusion myself. I rinsed the glasses from the coffee table and set them beside the sink before hanging the dish towel carefully on the handle of the oven. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time the way it had done for decades. Outside, the rain softened into a steady whisper over the porch roof and the maple leaves. I moved into the hallway where an old wooden cabinet stood against the wall. Inside the top drawer were several neatly organized envelopes and folders that had grown thicker over the years. Robert and I had always believed that planning quietly was one of the most important habits a person could learn. Long before Chloe began wondering about the value of this house, Robert and I had spent many evenings at this very table discussing the future. We believed money should never be the center of a person's life, but we also believed it should be handled with care. After he passed away, I continued those habits alone. Every few months, I reviewed documents, letters, and notes that outlined the choices I might eventually make. The folder I removed that evening was labeled simply with a date from several years earlier. Inside were papers from a meeting I had attended in the city with a man named Thomas Carter. Mr. Carter had been Robert's attorney for nearly 30 years, and he understood how carefully Robert thought about the future of everything he built. I remembered that meeting clearly. It had taken place in a quiet office overlooking the courthouse square downtown. Mr. Carter had listened patiently while I explained that I wanted to make certain decisions long before anyone expected them. He never rushed the conversation and never assumed I had not already thought things through. That is one of the reasons I trusted him. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and opened it slowly while the rain continued outside. The papers inside outlined possibilities that few people in my family had ever imagined. For years, I had been considering how to turn the value of this home and the savings Robert left behind into something that would outlive both of us. Chloe's questions earlier that afternoon had not created this plan. They had only reminded me how close the time had come to put it into motion. I closed the folder again and returned it to the drawer before turning off the kitchen light. The house settled into its usual nighttime silence while the rain drifted softly across the roof. Somewhere across town, Chloe was probably feeling satisfied with the conversation she had started. She believed she was guiding events toward a future that would eventually benefit her. What she did not know was that the decision she hoped to influence had already been quietly waiting for the right moment to arrive. The following morning, the rain had passed and Cedar Ridge returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Sunlight filtered gently through the maple leaves outside the kitchen window while I poured a cup of coffee and opened the small notebook I had kept for years beside the table. Robert used to say that plans written down tend to become real much faster than plans that stay only in the mind. I believe that too. The notebook contained dates, phone numbers, and reminders that stretched back almost a decade. Near the middle of the pages was a name written neatly in blue ink: Thomas Carter. I closed the notebook and reached for the telephone on the counter. Mr. Carter answered after the second ring with the same calm voice I remembered from his office downtown. When I introduced myself, there was a brief pause before he said he was glad to hear from me. He remembered our last meeting clearly and asked whether I was ready to continue the conversation we had started several years earlier. I told him that the time had finally arrived. He suggested we meet the following afternoon at his office near the courthouse square. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on its cradle and finished my coffee while the quiet morning settled around the house. The drive into town took about 20 minutes along the same narrow road Robert and I had traveled countless times over the years. Cedar Ridge looked the same as always. The same hardware store on the corner. The same bakery with the red striped awning. Familiar places that never seemed to rush into the future the way larger cities do. Mr. Carter's office stood on the second floor of a brick building overlooking the courthouse lawn. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. He greeted me with a warm handshake and invited me to sit near the window where sunlight filled the room. Mr. Carter had aged a little since our last meeting, but his eyes still carried the careful patience that made people trust him with serious decisions. We spoke for several minutes about Robert and the years that had passed since the last time we sat together in that office. Then he opened a leather folder and placed several documents neatly on the desk. He asked whether I had changed my mind about the plan we had discussed. I told him I had not. If anything, recent conversations within my family had confirmed exactly why the plan mattered. Mr. Carter listened quietly while I explained that I wanted the house and everything connected to it to serve a purpose beyond inheritance. Robert and I had always believed opportunity should reach people who never expected it. For years we talked about the possibility of helping young students in Cedar Ridge who could not afford the education they deserved. Mr. Carter nodded slowly and reviewed the papers in front of him. He explained that the legal structure we discussed before was still the best path forward. The property could be placed into a foundation that would fund scholarships for local students year after year. It would require several signatures and a few formal steps, but the result would be permanent. I read each page carefully while the courthouse clock outside struck 3 slow chimes in the distance. When I finally signed my name at the bottom of the final document, Mr. Carter placed the papers back inside the folder and closed it with a quiet sense of completion. He looked at me for a moment and said that sometimes the most meaningful decisions are the ones made without noise. I thanked him and stood to leave, stepping back into the afternoon sunlight of the courthouse square. Somewhere across town, Chloe was probably still imagining a future built around the assumptions she carried with such confidence. What she did not know was that the future had already been carefully written in ink. The drive back from the courthouse that afternoon felt peaceful in a way that only comes after a decision has finally settled into place. The road leading out of town curved gently past the old baseball field and the small public library that had stood there since before Robert and I first moved to Cedar Ridge. I slowed the car slightly as I passed the library, remembering the afternoons I used to see local students sitting on the steps with backpacks beside them, flipping through borrowed textbooks and dreaming about futures that felt far away. That image had stayed with me for many years. By the time I reached my driveway, the sun was beginning to lower behind the maple trees, and the porch was already casting long shadows across the front yard. I stepped inside the house and placed my keys on the small wooden table near the door. The familiar ticking of the clock in the living room filled the quiet space. Nothing inside the house had changed. Yet everything felt different because the future had already begun moving in a direction that no one else knew about yet. Over the next several days, life in Cedar Ridge continued the way it always had. The grocery store remained busy on Saturday mornings. The bakery downtown still placed fresh bread in the front window before noon. People greeted one another on the sidewalks with the same friendly nods that small towns depend on. But something else had changed in a quieter way. Chloe began visiting more often. At first the visits seemed casual. She stopped by with coffee one afternoon and asked about the garden. Another evening she appeared with a small dessert from the bakery and suggested we sit on the porch while the air cooled after sunset. Each conversation followed a similar path. It began with family updates or stories from her job in the city, and slowly drifted toward questions about the house, my plans for the future, and whether I had given any more thought to what she called simplifying my life. I listened politely each time, offering calm answers without giving her the satisfaction of believing the discussion was moving exactly where she hoped. One evening, she leaned back on the porch swing beside me and looked across the yard while the cicadas hummed in the trees. She said she had been thinking a great deal about family lately and how important it was to make responsible decisions that protected everyone's future. Her voice carried the tone of someone offering wise advice, but the meaning underneath her words remained clear. Chloe believed the path ahead would eventually lead through this house and into the next chapter of her own plans. I nodded thoughtfully and watched the last light fade behind the maple branches. It was not difficult to see how certain she had become. The more often she visited, the more comfortable she seemed discussing possibilities that had never truly existed. She spoke about potential buyers moving into Cedar Ridge, about investment strategies, about the advantages of planning early. All the while she believed she was gently guiding the conversation toward a future she had already imagined. What she could not see was that every visit, every careful suggestion, and every confident assumption was quietly bringing her closer to the moment when that imagined future would finally meet the reality I had already set in motion. By the time October arrived, the air in Cedar Ridge had turned crisp, and the maple leaves along my driveway had begun drifting quietly to the ground. The town always slows a little in autumn. The afternoons become softer, the evenings grow longer, and people start gathering indoors earlier than usual. It was on one of those cool Sunday afternoons that I decided the moment had finally arrived. I called my brother Daniel and asked if he and Chloe could come by for dinner the following weekend. I said I had been thinking about the future of the house and wanted to share a few thoughts with the family. My words were simple, but I could hear the shift in Daniel's voice immediately. News like that travels quickly through families. Within 2 days, Chloe had already called twice asking if there was anything she should bring to dinner. Her tone carried a bright excitement. She did not bother hiding anymore. She spoke about recipes and desserts, but underneath every word was the same quiet expectation. When Saturday evening arrived, the sky over Cedar Ridge glowed with the soft orange light that only appears just before sunset. I set the dining table carefully the same way I had done hundreds of times before. The same white plates. The same silverware Robert and I used for holidays. The familiar comfort of routine has a way of calming a room before important conversations begin. When Daniel and Chloe arrived, their car headlights swept across the porch as they pulled into the driveway. Chloe stepped out first, carrying a bakery box tied with a small red ribbon. She greeted me with a warm smile and a quick hug, the kind of affectionate gesture people use when they believe good news might be waiting inside. Dinner began quietly. We talked about ordinary things at first. Daniel mentioned a project at work. Chloe described a new apartment building opening near her office in the city. But as the meal continued, I noticed how often her eyes drifted toward me, waiting for the conversation to reach the moment she believed was coming. Finally, she placed her fork down gently and leaned forward with a patient smile. She said she remembered that I wanted to discuss the future of the house. The room grew still in that small but unmistakable way that happens when everyone realizes a decision may soon be revealed. I folded my napkin beside the plate and looked at both of them calmly. I told them that the house had meant a great deal to Robert and me, and that I had spent many years thinking carefully about what should happen to it after I was gone. Chloe nodded slowly, her expression attentive but confident. She believed the path ahead had already been quietly arranged in the direction she expected. I explained that I had recently met with Mr. Carter downtown to finalize a plan Robert and I had first discussed many years earlier. At the sound of the attorney's name, Daniel looked surprised, but Chloe's smile remained steady. She likely assumed the conversation had been about organizing paperwork or preparing a will. I continued speaking slowly, choosing each word with care. I told them the house and the savings connected to it would soon belong to something called the Harper Education Foundation. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a very different weight. I explained that the foundation would provide scholarships for students from Cedar Ridge who could not afford college tuition on their own. Year after year, the house Robert built would help young people step into opportunities they never believed were possible. I watched Chloe's expression change slowly as the meaning of my words settled across the table. The future she had imagined had quietly disappeared before it ever truly began. For several seconds after I finished speaking, the only sound in the dining room was the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. Daniel sat very still, his hands resting on the table, as if he were carefully replaying every word I had just said. Chloe did not move at first. The confident smile she had carried into the evening slowly faded into a look of quiet disbelief. It was not anger. It was something closer to confusion, the kind people feel when a story they believed completely suddenly changes direction. I lifted my glass of water and took a small sip while the silence settled across the table. Outside the kitchen window, the last light of sunset had faded and the porch lamp had begun casting a warm glow across the yard. Chloe finally spoke, her voice softer now, as if she were trying to make sense of something that had shifted unexpectedly. She asked if the decision was final. I nodded gently and explained that the documents had already been signed and recorded. The house would remain standing exactly where it was, but its purpose would grow far beyond the walls Robert built all those years ago. Each year, students from Cedar Ridge would receive help paying for college. Some would become teachers. Some might become engineers, nurses, or scientists. The possibilities would stretch far beyond what this small town could normally offer them. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair and let out a quiet breath. I could see the understanding settle across his face before he spoke again. He said Robert would have liked that plan. I smiled at that because it was true. Robert always believed that the greatest value of anything we owned was the good it could create for someone else. Chloe remained quiet for a moment longer. She looked around the dining room, at the photographs on the wall and the worn wooden floor that had carried our family through decades of dinners and holidays. I could almost see the moment when the realization fully reached her. The future she imagined had never really existed. It had been built on assumptions about what mattered most to me. After a while she nodded slowly and folded her hands together on the table. There was no argument left to make because the decision had already become real. I stood and began clearing the plates while the conversation drifted into calmer territory. Daniel helped carry the dishes into the kitchen, and we spoke quietly about the garden and the cool autumn weather settling across town. Chloe joined us a few minutes later and offered to help with the dishes. Her voice sounded thoughtful now, the confident certainty from earlier replaced by something more reflective. When they finally left that evening, the night air had grown cool, and the sky above Cedar Ridge was filled with clear, steady stars. I watched their car disappear down the gravel road before stepping back onto the porch. The house looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same porch swing. The same maple tree shifting gently in the breeze. But somewhere in the future, long after the lights in this house had gone dark, students from this town would open acceptance letters and realize that a path they thought was impossible had suddenly become real. I sat down on the porch swing and listened to the quiet night settle around the yard. People sometimes believe wealth is measured by what you leave behind for family members who expect it. Robert and I always believed something different. The most valuable future is the one you create for people who never imagined it could belong to them.